Good evening. I want to begin by acknowledging the gravity of what we are witnessing in real time. The decision by Prime Minister Mark Carney to withdraw Canada from an $18 billion energy framework negotiation with the White House is not a minor diplomatic development. It is not a procedural disagreement between two neighboring governments over the fine print of a bilateral trade instrument. What we are observing tonight is a structural rupture in the North American energy architecture that has quietly underpinned the economic stability of both nations for the better part of 4 decades. And I think the American people deserve a clear, honest, and analytical account of what this means, not just for energy markets, not just for the communities in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania that depend on Canadian energy inputs, but for the broader trajectory of the United States economy at a moment when we can least afford additional headwinds. Let me begin with the fundamentals because I think it is important that we ground this conversation in data before we allow ourselves to be swept up in the political temperature of the moment. Canada is not a peripheral energy supplier to the United States. Canada is, by every serious metric, the single most important energy partner this country has. In 2023, the United States imported approximately 4.3 million barrels of crude oil per day from Canada. That figure represents roughly 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports. When we talk about Canadian energy, we are not talking about a supplementary source that can be substituted overnight with a phone call to Riyadh or a renegotiated contract with Norwegian suppliers. We are talking about a deeply integrated, physically interconnected energy system, pipelines, refineries, transmission corridors, and regulatory frameworks that took generations to build and that cannot be unwound without serious, lasting, and measurable economic consequences. The $18 billion figure at the center of tonight's news is itself worth examining carefully because I want to resist the temptation to treat it as an abstraction. $18 billion in energy trade is not simply a line item on a balance sheet. It represents natural gas flowing into New England homes during winter heating season. It represents hydroelectric power keeping the lights on across the northeastern United States. It represents Alberta crude feeding into Midwest refineries that produce the gasoline that Americans put in their cars every single morning. When Prime Minister Carney made the decision to halt these negotiations, and I want to be precise here, the reports indicate this was not a pause, not a cooling off period, but a deliberate termination of the framework. The downstream consequences began accumulating immediately. Markets do not wait for press conferences. Traders do not wait for diplomatic clarifications. The moment that signal entered the marketplace, the recalibration began. I have spent the better part of my professional life studying the way that policy uncertainty translates into economic behavior. One of the most consistent findings across decades of macroeconomic research is that uncertainty itself, independent of the actual policy outcome, is enormously costly. When businesses do not know whether a supply chain will remain intact, they do not simply wait and see. They begin hedging. They begin diversifying. They begin making capital allocation decisions that are suboptimal from a pure efficiency standpoint, but that are entirely rational given the informational environment they are operating in. What we are seeing tonight in Washington, and I use that word deliberately because the reaction across the Capitol is not confined to one agency or one department, is the instantaneous translation of policy uncertainty into economic anxiety. And that anxiety is well-founded. Let us talk specifically about the refinery situation in the American Midwest, because I think it illustrates the structural vulnerability more clearly than any abstract economic model. The refineries concentrated in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan were built, many of them decades ago, specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. This is not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate industrial policy decision made over many years by both governments and private sector actors, premised on the assumption that the Canada-US energy relationship was stable, predictable, and mutually beneficial. The refinery infrastructure is not easily convertible. You cannot simply redirect a refinery designed to process Canadian heavy crude to process lighter grades from the Permian Basin without significant capital investment, significant operational disruption, and significant time. We are talking about months, potentially years of transition. And during that transition period, production capacity is reduced, operating costs rise, and those costs are ultimately passed on to American consumers in the form of higher prices at the pump and higher home energy costs. I want to be careful here not to overstate the immediacy of the crisis, because responsible economic commentary requires precision. The deal that Prime Minister Carney has walked away from was a framework, a prospective agreement governing future energy flows and investment commitments. Existing contracts, existing pipeline agreements, existing transmission arrangements, these remain in place for now. The market disruption we are seeing tonight is not yet a physical supply disruption. It is a forward-looking disruption. It is the market pricing in the probability that the physical disruption follows. And history tells us with considerable consistency that when the market begins pricing in that probability, the probability tends to increase. Because once trust is broken between major trading partners, the process of rebuilding it is slow, painful, and never quite returns to the baseline that preceded the rupture. What concerns me most deeply as I look at this situation from the perspective of my years at the Federal Reserve and at the Treasury is the timing. The United States economy in the current period is navigating a genuinely complex set of crosscurrents. Inflation has moderated significantly from its peak, and I want to acknowledge that progress clearly and without equivocation. The labor market has demonstrated a resilience that has surprised many forecasters, including some of the most sophisticated models in our analytical toolkit. But underneath those headline numbers, there are real vulnerabilities. Consumer balance sheets, while stronger than they were during the depths of the pandemic period, are showing signs of stress at the lower end of the income distribution. Credit conditions have tightened. Business investment, particularly in manufacturing and industrial capacity, has been sensitive to interest rate levels in ways that we continue to monitor carefully. This is not the moment, in other words, when the American economy has surplus capacity to absorb a major energy supply shock. This is a moment when the margin for error is narrow, and the consequences of policy miscalculation are asymmetric. I will close part one by saying this. The panic that Washington is experiencing tonight is not irrational. It is, in fact, the appropriate response of a policy community confronting a development for which it is poorly prepared. The question, the urgent, consequential question, is what comes next. And that question deserves the kind of careful, data-driven, solution-oriented analysis that I intend to provide as we continue this conversation. The path forward exists. It is narrow, it requires political courage on both sides of the border, and it requires a degree of economic sophistication that has sometimes been in short supply in recent trade policy discussions. But it exists. And finding it should be the singular focus of every policymaker in Washington tonight. I want to turn now to the question of what this development means for the broader macroeconomic environment, because I think there is a tendency in moments of acute diplomatic crisis to focus exclusively on the immediate political narrative. Who said what? Which aide made which phone call? What the body language was in the last bilateral meeting, and to lose sight of the deeper structural and systemic implications that will outlast the news cycle by months and years. The termination of this $18 billion energy framework is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening inside a global economic environment that is itself under considerable strain, and the interaction between this specific bilateral rupture and those broader global pressures is what I want to examine carefully in this section of our conversation. Let us begin with the inflation dimension, because it is the one that will be felt most directly and most immediately by ordinary American households. One of the most important, and I would argue most underappreciated, contributors to the disinflationary progress that the United States has made over the past 18 months has been the relative stability of energy prices. When energy prices are stable or declining, they act as a deflationary force that offsets inflationary pressures in other sectors of the economy. They reduce transportation costs, which ripple through supply chains and moderate the prices of goods across virtually every category. They reduce home heating and cooling costs, which frees up household income for other forms of consumption. They reduce industrial input costs, which helps manufacturers maintain price discipline even when labor costs are rising. Energy price stability, in other words, is not merely an energy story. It is an inflation story. It is a cost of living story. And when you introduce significant uncertainty into the energy supply relationship with your largest and most integrated energy partner, you are introducing upward pressure on energy prices, and therefore upward pressure on inflation, at precisely the moment when the Federal Reserve is trying to maintain the credibility of its inflation fighting posture without unnecessarily restricting economic growth. I want to be precise about the transmission mechanism here because I think imprecision leads to bad policy conclusions. The immediate effect of tonight's news on energy prices will likely be moderate. Futures markets will adjust, traders will reprice risk. But the more significant effect will come in the medium term, over the next 6 to 18 months, as the uncertainty premium embedded in energy prices gradually increases, as investment decisions in the energy sector are deferred or canceled, and as the physical supply implications of a deteriorating Canada-US energy relationship begin to manifest in ways that are more difficult to reverse. This is what economists sometimes call the slow-moving crisis, a situation where the headline event is dramatic, but the real economic damage accumulates gradually beneath the surface in ways that are harder to see in real time, but that become painfully obvious in retrospect. The Federal Reserve will be watching this development extremely carefully, and I say that not as a bureaucratic observation, but as someone who understands intimately how the Federal Open Market Committee processes geopolitical and trade-related risks. The Fed's mandate is price stability and maximum employment. Both of those objectives are potentially affected by what has happened tonight. If energy prices rise as a consequence of this bilateral rupture, and if that energy price increase passes through into broader inflation measures, the Fed faces a genuinely difficult choice. It can tighten monetary policy to counteract the inflationary pressure at the cost of slowing economic growth and potentially pushing unemployment higher. Or it can look through the energy-driven inflation on the grounds that it is supply-side in nature and therefore not responsive to monetary policy tightening. But in doing so, it risks allowing inflation expectations to become unanchored, which would require much more aggressive tightening later. Neither option is comfortable. Neither option is without cost. And the fact that the Fed is now being forced to contemplate these options as a consequence of a trade policy decision made in Washington is itself a significant institutional concern. Now, let me turn to the labor market dimension, because I think it is equally important and somewhat less discussed in the immediate commentary surrounding tonight's news. The communities that are most directly exposed to a disruption in Canada-US energy trade are not abstract economic units. They are real places: Sarnia, Ontario, and Port Huron, Michigan, sitting on opposite sides of the St. Clair River, connected by pipelines and economic relationships that have supported good, middle-class employment for generations. They are the refinery towns of the Illinois Basin. They are the auto manufacturing communities of the Great Lakes region, where the energy inputs that power assembly plants and parts suppliers flow substantially from Canadian sources. They are the communities in New England, in Maine, in Vermont, in Massachusetts, where Canadian hydroelectric power represents a meaningful share of the electricity grid and where energy costs are already among the highest in the continental United States. When I speak about labor market implications, I am not speaking in the abstract language of aggregate employment statistics. I am speaking about the specific, identifiable risk that a prolonged deterioration in Canada-US energy relations will translate into plant curtailments, reduced operating hours, deferred capital investment, and ultimately job losses in communities that have already experienced significant economic dislocation over the past 2 decades. The manufacturing sector in the American Midwest has shown genuine signs of recovery and revitalization in recent years, driven in part by the reshoring of supply chains, in part by significant federal investment in industrial capacity through legislation passed in this and the previous Congress, and in part by the competitive advantages that access to affordable Canadian energy has provided to American manufacturers. That recovery is not irreversible. It depends on policy stability, supply chain reliability, and energy cost predictability. And all three of those foundations are now under pressure as a direct consequence of the breakdown in negotiations that Prime Minister Carney announced today. I want to address something directly that I know will be on the minds of many people watching and listening tonight, which is the question of whether the United States has viable alternatives to Canadian energy supply. This is a question I have heard raised in several contexts over the past few hours, and I want to answer it with the same directness and precision that I have tried to bring to every dimension of this analysis. The short answer is not at the scale, the speed, or the cost that would be required to substitute for Canadian supply without significant economic disruption. The longer answer requires some disaggregation by energy type. On the crude oil side, the United States does have substantial domestic production capacity, and the shale revolution has fundamentally changed the country's energy landscape in ways that were genuinely transformative. But as I noted earlier, the specific refinery infrastructure in the Midwest is calibrated to process Canadian heavy crude, and redirecting that infrastructure to process domestic light crude is neither instantaneous nor inexpensive. On the natural gas side, the pipeline infrastructure that connects Canadian supply to New England and the Northeast has no easy substitute. LNG imports from overseas are possible but significantly more expensive and logistically complex. On the hydroelectric power side, there is quite simply no substitute. You cannot replace Canadian hydroelectric power with domestic alternatives in the short or medium term without either accepting reduced grid reliability or significantly increased electricity costs. The geopolitical dimension of tonight's development also deserves serious attention, and I want to spend some time on it because I think it has implications that extend well beyond the bilateral Canada-US relationship. We are living through a period of significant global economic realignment, a period in which the architecture of international trade, investment, and supply chain organization that was built over the second half of the 20th century is being tested, strained, and in some cases fundamentally restructured. In that context, the ability of the United States to maintain stable, productive, mutually beneficial economic relationships with its closest allies is not merely a matter of bilateral interest. It is a matter of broader strategic positioning in a global economy where the competition for reliable supply chains, for stable energy sources, for trusted trade partners has become increasingly intense. When Washington panics tonight, and the panic is real and it is justified, it is panicking not just about $18 billion in energy trade. It is panicking about what the loss of Canadian confidence in American reliability as a partner means for the broader network of alliances and economic relationships that underpin American prosperity and American strategic influence. I will close part two with a reflection that I think is essential context for everything that follows. The relationship between Canada and the United States is, at its foundation, one of the most successful examples of economic integration between sovereign nations in the history of the modern world. It did not happen by accident. It was built through decades of patient diplomacy, through carefully negotiated frameworks, through the gradual accumulation of trust and institutional familiarity. The USMCA, its predecessor NAFTA, the myriad bilateral energy agreements and environmental frameworks and regulatory harmonization efforts that sit beneath those headline agreements, all of it represents an enormous accumulated investment in a partnership that has delivered enormous mutual benefit. Tonight, that investment is under threat, and the cost of allowing it to deteriorate further, the economic cost, the strategic cost, the human cost, is something that every policymaker in Washington needs to reckon with honestly and urgently. I want to dedicate this portion of our conversation to something that I believe is consistently underserved in the public discourse surrounding major trade and diplomatic ruptures of this kind, which is the question of institutional memory and policy architecture. When we talk about the Canada US energy relationship, we are not merely talking about a commercial arrangement between two governments. We are talking about a deeply layered institutional ecosystem, regulatory bodies, joint commissions, technical working groups, environmental monitoring frameworks, emergency coordination protocols that has been built up over decades and that performs functions which are invisible in normal times but become critically important precisely in moments of stress, like the one we are navigating tonight. The danger of a high temperature diplomatic confrontation is not only that it disrupts the headline commercial relationships, it is that it damages or destroys the underlying institutional infrastructure in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to rebuild and that leave both countries more vulnerable to future shocks. Let me be specific about what I mean, because I think specificity is essential here. The International Joint Commission, established by the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, has for over a century provided a mechanism for managing shared water resources, environmental disputes, and transboundary infrastructure questions between Canada and the United States. It operates quietly, largely outside public view, staffed by technical experts and commissioners who have developed over years the kind of institutional knowledge and working relationships that allow complex cross-border problems to be resolved before they become crises. The Canada US Energy Consultative Mechanism provides a similar function in the energy sector specifically, a standing forum for technical dialogue, data sharing, and early warning about potential supply disruptions or regulatory conflicts. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation sets and enforces reliability standards for the integrated North American electricity grid, a grid that does not recognize the international border between Canada and the United States because electrons, unlike diplomats, do not carry passports. These institutions matter enormously. And what concerns me deeply about the trajectory of the Canada US relationship over the period leading up to tonight's announcement is the evidence that these institutions have been under strain, that the technical working relationships that underpin them have been disrupted by the political temperature at the highest levels of both governments, that the quiet diplomacy that normally prevents bilateral disagreements from escalating into formal ruptures has been crowded out by the louder, more combustible dynamics of public confrontation. When Prime Minister Carney made the decision to terminate the energy framework negotiations, he was not making that decision in isolation. He was making it in a context shaped by months of accumulated frustration, perceived bad faith, and institutional erosion. And that context matters enormously for understanding what it will take to restore the relationship, because you cannot simply announce a new negotiation and expect the underlying institutional trust to reconstitute itself automatically. Trust in international economic relations, as in all human relationships, is built slowly and destroyed quickly. I want to turn now to the fiscal dimension of tonight's development, because I think it has received insufficient attention in the immediate commentary and because it has significant implications for the medium-term trajectory of the United States budget and debt situation. The $18 billion energy framework that Prime Minister Carney has walked away from was not merely a trade agreement.